The 22nd Amendment has two twos, and it limits the president to 2 terms. Two-term limit for the POTUS. George Washington, seen below, giving us the dead stare, was the first president, and if you remember a lot about him as president, he was the president. He set forward many precedents that future presidents followed, one of which was serving 2 terms. Washington could have run for a 3rd term. People were pushing him to run for a 3rd term. He would have easily won a 3rd term, but he didn't want the presidency to be a lifelong position. He deeply disdained the idea of royalty. That's why he wanted to be called Mr. President, not be called His Majesty, the Excellence of the American Countries, whatever, some crazy title they were coming up from. Washington wanted the president to be an elected representative of the people. And also, he feared that if presidency was a lifelong term, if you look in history, when a leader dies, there's a vacuum of power, and there would be conflict, war, civil war, and determine who the next leader would be. He wanted a peaceful transition of power. He knew that in order to make that happen, he had to be alive and retire and pass leadership on to a successor who won an election peacefully. And this precedent that he sets for 2 terms and a peaceful transition to power goes on from president to president to president, all the way to FDR, our 32nd president. And there he is down the bottom now. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to navigate a lot of crises as president. Major, not just nationwide, worldwide crises. When he was elected in 1932, the economic calamity that was the Great Depression had been underway for more than 2 years. And he put forward many reforms to try to help the economy with his program called the New Deal. But by the end of his 2nd term, going into 1940, World War II had already begun. Europe and Asia are embroiled in this massive conflict. And he really felt that the U.S. eventually was going to get pulled into it, even though the U.S. at this time was not. Hey, Auto Recovery, thanks. Appreciate you being there. And he knew in his heart that because we were such strong allies of Great Britain, that he really opposed fascism and imperialism, which was what was being held by the Axis powers. He knew that we were going to be getting involved in that war, and he wanted to continue steady leadership going into that period. So because of World War II happening, he chose to run for an unprecedented 3rd term. And then December 7th, 1941, date that shall live in infamy, Pearl Harbor, U.S. gets pulled into the war, and now for the next 3 years, he is the wartime president. Now he's up for, there's another election coming up in 1944. The U.S. is still at war. We're winning, but we're still at war. And he wants to see the war to an end. He wants to try to establish a lasting peace with the creation of the United Nations and other things after the war. So he decides to run for a 4th time, which is probably not a great idea since he was in pretty poor health by that point. It was pretty run down, and early into his 4th term, he has an aneurysm and dies. And afterwards, many people start looking back on this and saying, although Roosevelt was a great president, one of our best, the fact that we had somebody that stayed in office until they died for 4 different terms, that's very un-Washingtonian. It's kind of going against the precedent that Washington set. And now that, FDR broke that bubble and served 2 more terms after Washington, many people feared that this would just become the norm now, and that the president would be a king-like leader, would be elected and again and again and again, and serve for the rest of their life. And they felt that was a bit against the principles of the U.S. So in 1951, the 22nd Amendment is passed, and the president can only be elected to 2 terms. They're constitutionally ineligible to run. So if you look, you can see the 5 presidents that were elected and served 2 full terms. There were Nixon was elected to 2 terms, but he resigned in the middle of one. So here you see the presidents that were elected to 2 full terms. And I'm willing to bet each and every one of them at the end of their second term, when each of them was really popular and widely liked, would have liked to have been able to run for a 3rd term and would have had a good chance of getting elected. But because of the 22nd Amendment, it stopped that from happening, and we have a peaceful transition of power like Washington envisioned continuing. The last amendment we're going to talk about is the Presidential Succession Amendment, the 25th Amendment. And the idea for this came about in 1963, one of the horrible days of American history, November 22nd, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas, and is shot in the head as he drives in a motorcade. Sadly, here you see him a few moments before his death. And he was shot at about 12:30 in the afternoon, but he didn't die until, it wasn't pronounced dead until 1, and he lived, despite the injury, which was catastrophic, for another 30 minutes. And there was a fear that, well, what if the president doesn't die from this injury? He obviously will never be the same person after getting shot in the head. And many in the government realize that if the president is incapacitated but still alive, the president has a stroke, is in a coma, falls into dementia, that there's no way to replace the president. Constitutionally, they're president until the end of their term. And this is a big fear. In fact, if you look back in U.S. history, the 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, toward the end of his second term, had a stroke and was pretty much incapacitated for much of the end of his presidency. His wife, the First Lady, pretty much ran things for him, and he wasn't in position, because he had such a bad stroke, to run the presidency. And there was nothing anyone could do at that time because there was no 25th Amendment. There is also a fear, since this is at the height of Cold War, that what if there's a nuclear attack that hits Washington, D.C., and many of our leaders are wiped out all at once? How can we have a succession of power to make sure that if the president and vice president are both killed, that we can have a line of succession of who will be in charge in the event of the worst possible situation? That leads to the passing of the 25th Amendment. Few things happen with the 25th Amendment, a few big changes. One, if the president asks for the vice president to become the acting president, he can ask Congress to authorize the vice president temporarily, and that can happen. Let's say, for example, President Reagan had heart surgery during his presidency. He had to be knocked unconscious. He was shot during his presidency. He was unconscious. So during that time period when he was having surgery, Vice President Bush was the acting president. So this allows us to have an acting president if the president is temporarily incapacitated, but also allows for removal of the president of the United States if the president is permanently incapacitated, is no longer able to serve and perform their abilities and duties of office. And then the vice president can inform the leaders of Congress, and together they can sign the authorization to remove the president. So it had to be one of the leaders of the president's administration and the leaders of both chambers of Congress to be able to do this. This is a pretty severe act. But once again, this is in the act of if the president is in a coma, if the president suffers a debilitating injury and no longer has semblance, if they become really sick with something like Alzheimer's disease where they're not in control of their faculties anymore, the vice president can step in and ask Congress to together force the president to step down. This also sets a line of succession. Here you see 7 people in the line of succession. If the president and vice president are deceased or not able to serve, which goes from the president currently, President Trump, then the vice president Pence, then the Speaker of the House Pelosi, then the president pro temp, one of the leaders of the Senate, Chuck Grassley. Then it goes into the cabinet positions, Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, the Attorney General, so on and so forth. And if we look, we can see that this actually goes on in 20 different positions of the line of succession, in case there's an event where they need somebody to be able to step in. This also put in place one more change, that if the vice president is to die or resign or is impeached, is no longer able to serve as vice president, the president can name a new vice president. The first vice president who was appointed and not elected vice president was Gerald R. Ford. Gerald R. Ford also would go on to become the only president who wasn't elected president or vice president when he becomes president after Richard Nixon resigns. So, that was a lot. My question for you. Multiple two-term presidents since the passing of the 22nd Amendment have expressed an interest in being able to run for a third term. If a two-term president has a high approval rating for the job they're doing, people feel overwhelmingly throughout the United States they're doing a good job, are happy with the job they're doing, does it make sense for them to be allowed to run for a third term? Should the 22nd Amendment be repealed? Argue for or against. I'm looking forward to reading your answers below. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.